Welcome to the Agent of Wealth podcast with Mark Bautis from Bautis Financial. In this podcast, Mark helps guide you towards financial freedom, ensure you never run out of money, and create a balance in life that prioritizes what is most important to you. Join us for this journey as Mark draws from years of expertise and guest experts to solve the multiple wealth building challenges involved in your financial life.
Welcome back to the Agent of Wealth. This is your host, Mark Bautis. Today I'm joined by the Bautis Financial team for a special book club discussion. We've covered 14 books so far, but for those of you who may be new to these episodes, let me quickly explain how it works. One of our team members selects a book for everyone in the office to read. This month, I selected the book, and then leads a discussion about the book here on the podcast. We'll share valuable takeaways, our general thoughts, discuss how we plan to implement any insights that we picked up from the book into our business or personal lives. So with me today is John, Kayla, Kira, and Dylan. I chose the book Extreme Ownership, How U.S. Navy SEALs Lead and Win by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. So it's been a book that's one of those ones that you purchase in my Kindle and I never wound up reading. So I've wanted to read it for a while. Jocko and Leif are ex-Navy SEALs, and it's a book about leadership. They take their leadership principles they learned from the military and how they can be applied to other areas, such as business or your personal life. Jocko has a pretty popular podcast out there, so I've always seen like clips of him, listened to him on other podcasts, listened to his podcast. He's interesting. He's like one of those stereotypical military, no-nonsense type of guys. And I've always been curious about military leadership in sports, and how you can take some of those things. And so I thought the book would be interesting, and when it came up time for me to pick it, that's the one I chose. Book I found to be pretty straightforward to read. They have, I think it's a set of 12 principles. They dedicate a chapter to each of the principles, and the way they cover the principle is they talk about a story from their past in the military and how that principle was observed, a problem or an issue that it uncovered, how they resolved it, how they addressed it, and then it's also then how it correlates or how it applies to life and business. And then after, one of the things they talk about is after their military careers were over, they do a lot of consulting to corporations on how to apply these principles. So I thought it was a good book. It was a pretty easy, straightforward to read. If you were interested in the military, if you're interested, they do talk a lot about their war in the Middle East and a lot of those stories. If you're interested in that, then you probably found the book interesting. If you aren't, then maybe the principal part was interesting and the leadership part was interesting. But a lot of it is they do cover the military aspects of things. So what we'll do is, the way we're going to do this session of the book club is everyone on the team pick their favorite principle from the book. So we're going to cover 5 of the 12 principles. Each of us will talk a little bit about that principle, what resonated with them, and why they thought that was their favorite one. So what we'll do is we'll start with John, and I know your favorite one was, which actually is the title of the book, Extreme Ownership.
Yeah, so I really was drawn to this chapter because I really feel it kind of sets the stage for the rest of the book, and really just gets to the heart of where Jocko is coming from and where I imagine where this whole concept had started with him. And the primary message is that a true leader must fully embrace responsibility for all actions and results, regardless of who directly caused them. This idea of ego versus owning the situation as a leader. It's very simple. I mean, from at a high level, that it's just that. It's like, a true leader, we've all heard the expression, the buck stops with me. If you're the one who's in charge, and someone that's under you makes a mistake, ultimately it is your fault because things didn't follow through. And I like the format of the book with the way that it starts out almost like if it was a movie. You'd see like this scene in like the military, and then it would kind of shift to where Jocko is now working with some companies and giving some examples on both sides. And in most of the chapters, if not all the chapters, if I remember correctly, start with a military example. In this chapter, Jocko gives the example of his experience with being a leader and how he ultimately took ownership of a situation that was very serious in Iraq. He was involved with what they call a blue on blue under his command, which is when U.S. troops are ultimately attacking each other and don't know it. And obviously this is not just frowned upon, but it's considered one of the worst things, honestly, that can happen under your command. So very, very serious when this went down. And it goes into very much detail how this all kind of panned out. He shows up to the scene and they're surrounding this building and there's fire coming from the building and they don't realize that it's actually U.S. troops. A soldier was killed. There was a few others wounded. So it was very serious. And from that point, the military came in. His commanding officers came in. There was an investigation. Long story short there, after analyzing what went wrong and taking a minute to really put together a report as to what had happened, Jocko realized that they're looking for someone to blame. And as he looked through the chain of command and everything that went down, he started to realize that he was the commanding officer and he needed to own what happened. He sits down his, troop and asks them directly, like, who's to blame? And a few people actually stepped forward and said, it was my fault. I did this, or a few people came forward and he said, nope. And he said, in the end, he said, it was my fault. I'm the one who's to blame. I'm your commanding officer and I'm going to take blame for this. And, he decided to swallow his ego and accept full responsibility. And this allowed him to quickly shift to focusing on what went wrong and coming up with some solutions and vowing to looking for those solutions to vow that it would never, ever happen again. Through this, not only did he most likely avoid getting relieved of duty, military for getting fired, but he ended up gaining some respect from his direct reports and commanding officers by owning this. And he realized that by taking this complete ownership, it set the standard for his team and encouraged them to adopt the same type of mindset. I think that some of the key takeaways, and these are some of the things that I found directly from the chapter, is like accepting responsibility requires humility and courage. Doing so is necessary to learn, grow, and improve. So just like that ego and swallowing your ego and having the courage to step forward is necessary. He found was necessary to learn and grow from those mistakes. The buck stops with you. He then shifts to more or less I'll call it the business that they may have started, working with businesses to help them apply these his military experience to the corporate world. And he uses this example of a VP that he was working with, a VP of manufacturing of a company that was very knowledgeable, very experienced. This company had brought this gentleman in to set forth some plans and set some goals. And every quarter that would go by, he would meet with the board and they would have these executive quarterly meetings. And it would just end up with a lot of excuses as to why so little of his plan was being executed. He felt like his job was somewhat at risk because of this. He wasn't following through, but he had an ego. So in order for Jocko to be effective, he knew he was going to have to take an indirect approach to coach him to be more effective in his role. As you can imagine, Jocko learned as much as he could about, this gentleman, what he's been doing to try and implement these plans and some of the problems that he may have encountered along the way. He realizes through his conversation with the VP that he's just simply just making excuses why his plans are not being executed. And he's literally taking zero ownership in essence. Fast forward, through conversation and Jocko, through his application of and sharing of some of his examples through military, and he was eventually able to get the manager to realize he was just making excuses all along the way and help him realize that, these excuses, every example of why things aren't happening are excuses and ultimately could be tied back to his lack of leadership and leading as opposed to telling people what to do. He eventually realized that it was critical for him to leave his ego at the door, take ownership, and essentially, find some solutions. And they were able to work through or figure out in the context of his business what that meant for him to lead. And ultimately, they ended up seeing a lot of improvement. So I really like the fact that he gave these real life examples, and shows a real life example of how it can not only apply to business, but in a lot of areas of our life.
Yeah, I think too many people are looking, whenever something goes wrong, how can I blame someone else, or how can I CYA cover my ass or cover your ass? And instead, what Jocko poses is, you take responsibility. And I think people appreciate that when, if, people understand that things are going to happen that aren't going to go right. And if you take responsibility, if you, he did that post-mortem on it to figure out, okay, what went wrong? How can I prevent this from ever happening again? And I think that goes a long way, rather than looking to, okay, who can I blame for this? How can I make sure that I come out unscathed and looking okay, and put the blame on someone else. So yeah, I mean, I think this chapter definitely set the tone for the book, and it's the main principle. Obviously, it's the name. Second principle we're going to cover, Kira will talk about, and that's no bad teams, only bad leaders.
Yeah, so this chapter followed the one that John just spoke about, and it built upon that same concept of extreme ownership. Purpose here was to emphasize the role of leadership in shaping the success of a team. The chapter is called No Bad Teams, Only Bad Leaders, and it begins by Leif recounting his experience observing a portion of Hell Week in the Navy SEAL basic training course. He was participating in this specific example as an instructor, so he had gone back years later after he had already served as a Navy SEAL, and he was looking at the incoming class. In this portion of the training, there was an exercise that involved boat crews running a series of obstacles while they were holding these really large, heavy rubber boats. And he explained that at this portion of Hell Week, the individuals had no sleep. They were just put under a grueling amount of physical and mental hardship. But for this purpose of this specific routine, the crews were split up into groups of 6 people. And of the groups of 6, I think there were 6 groups of 6, maybe more, but we'll focus on 6 for now because we want to zone in on group 2 and group 6 here. So in each of these groups, one was named the boat crew leader, and then it was that leader who would go up to the instructor, receive verbal instructions for each obstacle. Then they had to go back to their crew, to their team, and explain what the task was. So the other 5 people on the team did not know what specific obstacle they were running with the boats. So it had to just be given instructions by that one leader. Now, these obstacles were ran back to back to back. There were multiple of them, and it was a race to see who would come in first, who would come in second, and so on and so forth. So one of the crews, boat crew 2, was consistently excelling. They won each obstacle, and they won them by a landslide. That, in winning, gave them a break from the next task, I believe, or they had more time to breathe and to relax and kind of take a break. Whereas another crew number 6, were underperforming consistently. So they lost each round. And as a result of losing each round, they were getting punished and called out. And obviously that was just making their morale go further and further down on top of already losing in the task. I believe it's Leif's idea. Him and the instructor come up with the idea to demonstrate the impact of leadership. They decided to see what would happen when they swapped the leaders of those 2 crews. So sending the leader of crew 2 to work with crew 6 and the leader of crew 6 to work with crew 2. So the winning leader to work with the losing team and vice versa. It was interesting because the results were absolutely striking. The formerly struggling crew number 6 quickly improved, and they began performing well under their new leader, originally from crew 2. And they ended up being neck and neck with the previously winning crew, who now had the leader from crew 6. The winning crew had slightly reduced efficiency. So actually the crew that was coming in last came in first. And this story was basically used in the beginning of the chapter to prove the essential idea of the chapter, that there are no bad teams. It just comes down to the leader of the team. So then in the application to business part of this section, there was another story in this chapter. It was interesting, but I just really loved that boat crew story, especially because it gave really the reader an insight into Hell Week and how complicated and tough these tasks are. But in the application to business section, it spoke about an experience the authors had working with a CEO of a financial services company who had been experiencing issues with the company's bottom line after a failed product rollout. The CEO had listened in on some of the speaking engagements that the authors have done on extreme ownership and completely accepted the concept, implemented it himself, and he asked them to come to the company to teach it to the leadership team. Now, the issue began with one of the company's key department leaders, the Chief Technology Officer, or CTO. It was in his department where the failure of the product rollout lied. And while he was able to recognize some of the failures and absorb or own them as his responsibility, there were a round of conversations in which he really would not take extreme ownership. He refused, he got agitated, he really did not accept the concept of owning the failure of the entire company based on this one product launch. The story was interesting. It ended up with what you may expect while you're reading this book. The CEO of the business ended up letting the CTO go, and that was because he was the one piece of the puzzle that was missing in the implementation of extreme ownership within the business as a whole. Over time, the business ended up having growth and success with a new CTO in place. When the author was talking about this application of business, he was referring back a lot to the story of the boat cruise. There are sort of like 5 main takeaways. To be a good leader, you should provide the following. You should take ownership and accountability. You should provide clear expectations and direction. You should have a positive attitude and confidence. You should instill a sense of purpose, and you should exhibit effective communication and teamwork. And then before I wrap up, I just wanted to share one of the quotes from the chapter. Quote, "There are only 2 types of leaders, effective and ineffective. Effective leaders that lead successful high-performance teams exhibit extreme ownership. Anything else is simply ineffective. Anything else is bad leadership."
Yeah, I think it just highlights how critical having a good leader is. The regular season in the NFL just finished last week, and the day after, on Monday, it's called Black Monday because they fire a bunch of coaches. And it's because the owners believe that, okay, how critical having a good leader is. And that's the one way that they can turn around their team. That's why the coaches get paid a lot of money in professional sports, yet they never actually step on the field. They're there to lead their teams. This chapter hit home for me in the story about the boats and the races. Not many people know, but I spent a year at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, and this was one of the things that we did down there. And you think inflatable boat, and it's like this little thing, but I don't know how many pounds these things were, but they were really heavy, and they would mess with you. They would put short people and tall people on the boat. So you'd have to run first distance with the boat, and then you'd actually have to do an obstacle course. So you're running distance with a boat over your head, while holding the boat over your head. Some people are tall and they're holding it on their head. Some people are shorter. They have their arms extended. And you really would have to kind of figure out, work as a team and to figure out how best to do this. Because when you went over, there was an obstacle course that you first did without the boat. Second, you had to do it with your team, with the boat, and the boat couldn't touch any of the obstacles. If it did, you were disqualified. So in some cases, what we had to do is we basically had to make like this human buffer where if we were going over like a rope section or over some obstacle, we would put the team, us, like in between the obstacle, and the boat would go on top of us so that it would never hit. And you're basically getting crushed by the boat as you're doing it. So while we weren't on the beach and weren't in Hell Week and SEALs like Leif and Jocko were, we definitely brings back some stories of it. All right, so third principle, I'm going to turn it over to Dylan.
Yeah, so I chose the chapter titled Believe. And really this chapter explained the importance of everyone on a team being on the same page and believing the mission that is trying to be accomplished. If the leader of a team doesn't believe in the mission, it's difficult to inspire others and convey confidence to the team. On the flip side of that, if the team is able to see how their efforts contributed to the goal or mission, they're more likely to fully engage. So, as mentioned before in the book, the chapter gives an example of a military story in Ramadi where SEAL members resisted implementing orders from higher command because they didn't, at the end of the day, they didn't fully understand and believe the reasoning behind the orders. And this happens very often. But at the time, the U.S. military was generally handling the security of Ramadi and Iraq. So the orders that there was some resistance towards were that Iraqi soldiers would be included in every SEAL team operation moving forward. This left a lot of discomfort amongst the team members, and they were not happy because the battlefield was very dangerous, and these Iraqi soldiers didn't have the same training or the same equipment as these SEALs did. Jocko was the leader, and he was able to frame a discussion with his team through a different kind of lens. He let them express their opinions and all their skepticism towards the new orders, and they went back and forth, and there was a lot of unease and discomfort amongst the team. But Jocko then said, if the Iraqi military can get to a point where they can handle, if they can't get to a point where they handle the security of their own country, who is going to do it? And it kind of made everyone sit there looking at each other in silence because they all knew the underlying answer to the question. And he continued to question. He then questioned what the future in Ramadi would look like if they couldn't get these Iraqi soldiers up to speed and couldn't get them to secure the nation. And at that moment, everyone on the team fully understood the purpose of the orders and the bigger picture of the mission, which isn't always easy to identify. At the end of the day, it relieved the skepticism and the resistance that was occurring amongst the team. And it really allowed them to carry on with the orders and do it with confidence. From this story, I learned personally that it's very important to see clarity when you don't understand or agree with an initiative. The biggest takeaway I had from the chapter in general, though, and I'm going to say a quote, not from the chapter specifically, but I took this away, is that belief isn't about blind obedience. It's about deeply understanding and aligning with the underlying goals so you can lead authentically. And I think that this statement really relates to financial planning in general, because as financial planners, it is truly important to fully understand the client's goals, values, and unique circumstances. And as we know, every client is different. No client is the same. And being able to understand their values, their goals, it helps build trust and it develop a more genuine and authentic relationship. And planners must educate clients about the recommendations that they're making to them to help them understand and believe the process and lead them to stick with it. A lot of the time, people have trouble understanding the why, but as planners, it's very important to lead them to understand why. And when planners help clients see how each step being made ties into the long-term financial plan, it empowers the client to remain confident and disciplined in pursuing those objectives.
Yeah, you highlight a good point on, one of the things that we struggle with a lot of times with the people we work with is getting them to actually take action. We can say, well, maybe they have other things going on or it's not important, but if we're able to successfully communicate why we're recommending this or why we're recommending that, or how what we're suggesting they do gets them to what they're, as like what Jocko would use, complete their mission or successfully get to where they want to go, maybe that motivates them more to take that action. So Jocko mentions this in multiple chapters in the book about how important the communication is, going from top down, but also from down top. When things come in, whether it's an assignment, an order, or a project or something that's specific that we're trying to work on, it's important that the communication flows both ways and is utilized, and that's how you have a successful mission on it. I'm going to take the fourth principle, which is cover and move. So cover and move, it's the story. It's another one from Ramadi in which a SEAL team was pinned down against enemy insurgents, and they were stuck. They basically had to move their position, but if they moved, or if they actually came out of their cover that they were taking, they would have been shot. The SEAL team was working, so they had help from an Army unit as well as Marine Corps unit. Now, a lot of times you think of, okay, those are three separate units. How do they coordinate? How do they communicate? How do they work together? In this case, they implemented a strategy called cover and move, which is, if you kind of think of any of your Hollywood movies, you see like a gunfight and you see one group down, they're taking cover. The other group pops up, fires to suppress the enemy while the other group can move their position. The other group gets to their position, they pop up, they shoot, suppress, and while the other group can move. And together in tandem, now they're able to achieve or get to where they wanted to go. And I think, so this was what Jocko said, is this is the only way that you can successfully do this, is if you coordinate, if you're all under the same, your goal is all the same, is to successfully complete that mission. And how we apply this one, or how I apply this one a lot, or kind of thought of this one, is a lot of times when we're working on a financial plan with someone, we'll work with their other professionals, whether it's a CPA, an attorney, or some other professional. And you can always think about, how can I make myself look good in the eyes of the client, right? Instead, the approach should be, how can I work with this other professional so that we together help the client achieve their goals, right? So if we just take a CPA as an example, we may be doing something for the client or recommending something that has some kind of tax implication, but the CPA may see it from another way or see another option that we don't see. And together, if we collaborate together, we can, I guess, present a better outcome, or have a better outcome than if we're all trying to be in it for ourselves and how can we make ourselves look good. So, I think the cover and move is another principle that can be utilized in different areas. And the same thing internally, if we're working on a project for someone, and if we're looking at things in silos rather than, and we're obviously a small team with the 5 of us being the team, but at times we're working on the same project in different areas, where maybe we're looking at one thing on the investment side or a portfolio side, but not really taking into account what someone else is doing regarding, gifting or estate planning strategy. So a lot of times internally, we also have to work together and make sure that, we're looking at the implications of one thing we do, one decision we make, and how does it impact other things that the client has going on. All right. So for the last principle we'll cover today, I'm going to turn it over to Kayla.
Yeah, I chose chapter 6, and in this chapter, Willink and Babin explain why keeping things simple is essential for success. And they talk about how complicated plans usually fail because they confuse people and they lead to mistakes. For his examples, he does another story from Ramadi, Iraq, and he's talking about where there was the SEAL team created a really detailed and complicated plan. And there was a lot of different moving parts, and it involved a lot of different teams. And the complexity of it caused some problems where some of the team members didn't understand what their roles were. And then this inevitably led to mistakes and delays during their operation. The leaders noticed this and they realized that things were too confusing. So they worked on simplifying it, and they focused on the most important goals and made sure that everyone understood exactly what they needed to do. And to double check this, they had their team members repeat the plan back to them in their own words so that they knew everyone understood what they should be doing. And that way, like when unexpected challenges came up, people were more easily able to adjust, like to complete their mission because they knew what they should be doing. And then in another example, he talks about helping a company improve their workplace safety because their safety strategy was too complicated and employees didn't understand what they were supposed to be doing. So accidents were happening, but Willink helped the company simplify the plan and cut a lot of unnecessary steps and just focused on what the important actions were. And then once the plan was easier to understand, then the employees started following it and less accidents happened. So I think the takeaway from this chapter is just that simpler can be better, and that complex plans are way harder for people to follow. So they're more likely to fail. I think this relates a lot to what we do, especially when we start working with people. Like we could deliver a really long financial plan that's 100 pages or longer. But in the beginning, sometimes people just want to work in phases of things. So it might be getting an emergency fund set up in phase 1, phase 2, looking at investments and retirement, phase 3, education planning, and so on. So I think just keeping things simple is the main takeaway.
Yeah, the example you gave of how this correlates to us or how it applies to us was the first one that came to mind when I thought of it as was going through it as well. Finance can be complex, and sometimes I think the industry makes it complex on purpose. But if you keep it simple, if you break it up into chunks, I think that goes a long way to achieving what you're trying to achieve when we work with someone. So yeah, I mean that I thought this was a great chapter as well. So these were the 5 principles that kind of stood out to us, but I thought some of the other ones were really good too. There's one about prioritizing things and how important that is. There's a principle on decentralized command. One of the things that he says is that a really high performing team, you should actually be able to take the leader out and the team should still be a high performing team. And if it's running on all cylinders, humming along, a team should be able to do that. So I'm sure you can come up with more principles than that, but I think covered the ones that really made sense, really kind of hit home. That's what we have for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Like we said, we are financial planners. If anyone is interested in talking to us about finance, you can schedule a call with us at bautisfinancial.com/call. Thank you everyone for tuning in today. Don't forget to follow the Agent of Wealth on the platform you listen from and leave us a review of the show. We're currently accepting new clients, and if you'd like to schedule a one-on-one consultation with our advisors, please do so at bautisfinancial.com/call.
Thank you for listening to the Agent of Wealth podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Bautis Financial. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional financial planning and investment advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investments and financial planning.